if you ask the question, what is embodied mind, why is it interesting to me? I guess the answer I would give would have to begin by situating precisely the issues of cognitive science in general. And by cognitive science, I really mean especially neuroscience, but also psychology, linguistics, artificial intelligence, as an assemblage of disciplines. Because in fact, cognitive science, when it was created back in the 50s and the 60s, made a theoretical option, an epistemological option, which is really, if you want, in reaction to which, not against which, but rather in reaction to which, or out of which, this idea of embodied mind or embodied cognition comes up, which is growing and growing over the last, I would say, 5-10 years, let's say. The contrast is actually quite simple to state. You want the mental space in which cognitive science was born had one fundamental metaphor, which is a very clear distinction between outside and inside. And in this distinction between outside and inside, outside meant that you had the source of information, and inside you had the machine to treat this information. You had the representations from which you would compute, you would calculate appropriate treatments, appropriate processing. Okay, and everybody recognizes this, of course, in a sort of some kind of a computer metaphor for understanding and knowledge. Also, the fundamental metaphor there is one of that belongs to the very important classical tradition of logic and semantics, in that what you have is a statement or a syntax or a representation that stands for something else, which is the outside. It corresponds to the truth or the statement of fact about the world. And this symbol is then what it gets treated, what it gets processed inside the programs of the mind, so to speak. It is this research program that guided most of cognitive science up until the 1970s. In reaction to that, or out of that, I would say that what I like to see as embodied cognitive science precisely differs fundamentally by shifting away from this dominant metaphor outside-inside. And the embodiment is precisely that what is essential for cognition is the fact that you always have cognition in an active, situated, embedded agent, which is in a world and in a history with that world. And therefore, the clear-cut distinction between outside and inside is clearly erased. Okay? There are other distinctions that are important, and we'll come to that. But that one is gone. So basically here, what you have to see is that instead of putting the emphasis on looking for information outside to be represented inside, what you see, what you look for is principles for how an active engagement and an active handling, an active history of a situated agent actually makes meaning and makes information come up, arise, be shaped, be formed. Okay? Which is why I like to call this way of looking at things the enactive view of cognitive science. Enactive, the word enaction in English is interesting because it connotes both action and shaping something, bringing forth something. So it's like you enact the play. Okay? So as you see, the fundamental metaphor, instead of being one of outside or inside, is actually one of walking and laying down a path in walking. As the famous poem from Antonio Machado says, there is no path, you lay down a path in walking. Now, this is reflected in many different ways in cognitive science. One of them, which is very interesting, is that it shifts the idea that the mind is inside the brain as the computer, as it were, that handles the information. That the mind is not embrained, but it's literally embodied. That is, it is not just the brain, but it is the brain in the body through the sensory and motor interfaces. And not only that, but through the roots of the nervous system into the rest of the body, the immune system, the hormonal system, the rest of the viscera and the organs, that counts. as the agent that is what is doing the cognizing, which is doing the act of knowledge. So you don't have an in-brain mind, you literally have an embodied mind. First of all, because you begin to understand that what you have to see is not simply some kind of linear information processing where you pick up information in the sensory side, you treat it, and then you have a response. Here, because you're putting the emphasis on an active, situated agent, the fundamental point is how this constant loop and circularity of sensory motor distributed loop throughout the brain and the body actually can create a coherent state. Let me put it this way. The key point here, from the point of view of embodied cognitive or an active cognitive science, is to see the brain not as an information processing system, but really as a dynamical system, where you have constantly mutual interactive processes going on in multiple parallel channels, which corresponds, of course, to the fact that, for example, if I'm looking at you, I'm not just passively receiving an image, I'm actively moving my eyes. I also have my visual cortex is not just receiving you and then passing it on further, because my visual cortex is also receiving all kinds of signals from, for example, the hormonal levels that I have, the emotional tonality, the posture at which I'm sitting, whether I'm sitting or standing up. All of that is a multiple determination that makes so that when I see you, you are a very subtle modulation of an entire bowl of ongoing interactive dynamical phenomena. So the key question for the inactive people, the inactive researchers, I would say, is shifted from how do you represent this processing in stage by stage in very local ways, to how to conceive of a global coherence or a global integration, what is known sometimes is described as a long-range integration in the brain. How does this entire constantly moving ball of spaghetti, as you might say, actually can produce significantly coherent state instead of being just a mess of a literally chaotic state as opposed to a technically chaotic state. This